I still remember the day everything changed. The house felt smaller than usual that evening. Everyone sat around the long dining table, but no one spoke to me. Their silence was heavier than any words. I had tried to explain myself earlier that afternoon, but nobody wanted to listen. According to them, I had made the biggest mistake of my life. They believed I had ruined the future of the family business. For years, our family had operated a successful logistics company. It had been built slowly through discipline, patience, and sacrifice. Every member of the family treated it like something sacred, except me. At least that was what they believed. 3 months earlier, I had suggested investing part of the company's savings into a new technology platform that could modernize our operations. I had studied the market for months before proposing it, but the investment had failed. The platform collapsed after the startup company behind it shut down suddenly. Millions were gone. That night, everyone blamed me. They believed my decision had destroyed years of hard work. I tried to explain that the investment had looked safe at the time. The numbers had been solid. The reports had been convincing. But none of that mattered anymore. All they saw was loss. One by one, they began to speak. Some voices were calm. Others were angry. The conclusion was simple. I was no longer trusted to handle any part of the company. Then came the words that hurt the most. They told me it would be better if I stepped away completely from the business, from the family decisions, from everything. That night, I packed a small bag and left the house where I had grown up. As I walked away, I realized something painful. I had not only lost my position in the company, I had lost my place in the family. But what they didn't know was this. The failure that destroyed my reputation would eventually lead me somewhere none of them expected. The first few weeks after leaving were the hardest time of my life. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. It was nothing like the large house I had grown up in, but it was quiet, and for the first time in years, I was completely alone. The silence forced me to think. Every morning, I woke up with the same question in my mind. Had they been right about me? Maybe I had been careless. Maybe I had rushed the investment too quickly. But the more I studied the situation, the more something felt strange. The startup company that collapsed had looked incredibly strong on paper. Their technology had attracted attention from several major firms. Yet they had shut down almost overnight. That kind of failure usually didn't happen without warning. I began reviewing every document I had saved from the deal. Reports, emails, contracts, investor briefings. For hours each day, I studied them carefully. At first, nothing unusual appeared, but then I noticed something odd. Several of the company's financial reports had been prepared by the same consulting group that had encouraged our investment. The numbers they presented had been extremely optimistic. Too optimistic. I dug deeper into their analysis and compared with independent market reports from the same period. The differences were shocking. Key risks had been ignored. Market warnings had been completely left out of the reports we received. It looked almost like the investment had been designed to fail. The thought disturbed me. If the reports had been manipulated, then the collapse might not have been an accident. Someone could have planned it. I wasn't sure yet, but the possibility pushed me to keep investigating. Night after night, I followed the financial trails connected to the startup, and slowly, a disturbing picture began to form. The company had not simply collapsed. It had been drained from the inside. The more I studied the financial records, the clearer the pattern became. Money had been quietly moving out of the startup months before its collapse. Small transfers at first, then larger ones. The funds were being sent through several shell companies before disappearing completely. Whoever planned it had been careful. The transactions were spread across different countries and different accounts. At first glance, it looked like normal business expenses. But when I placed all the numbers together on a timeline, the truth became obvious. Someone had been stealing from the company long before it shut down, and our family business had been one of the final investors before everything collapsed. That meant our money had arrived just in time to be taken. The realization made my hands shake. If this was true, then my decision to invest had not destroyed the company. We had been targeted, but proving it would be difficult. The financial trail ended inside several offshore accounts with hidden ownership. Tracking them required resources I didn't have. Still, I refused to stop. Every day, I continued researching a consulting firm that had recommended the investment to us. Eventually, I discovered something even more surprising. That consulting group had advised several other companies that also invested in the startup shortly before it collapsed. And those companies had suffered the same losses we did. It wasn't just us. Dozens of investors had been affected. The more I learned, the clearer it became. This wasn't a failed startup. It was a carefully designed fraud. But the biggest problem remained. No one from my family would listen to me anymore. To them, I was still the person who had wasted their money. They believed I had destroyed everything. So I kept the investigation to myself. Because if I could uncover the full truth, one day they would realize something important. I had never betrayed the family. 6 months passed. During that time, I worked several temporary jobs just to survive. None of them were connected to finance or business. I kept my head down and avoided talking about my past. But every night, I continued investigating the fraud. The trail eventually led me to a surprising place. One of the shell companies connected to the stolen funds had recently invested in a new logistics firm. That caught my attention immediately. Logistics was the same industry as our family business. The new company had appeared suddenly and was expanding very quickly. They were opening distribution centers across several regions. But when I examined their corporate records, I noticed something familiar. The consulting group that misled us had also advised this new company. That connection couldn't be a coincidence. If the same group was involved again, the new logistics company might also be part of a larger scheme. I spent weeks studying their operations. Eventually, I realized something important. Their expansion strategy depended heavily on acquiring struggling logistics businesses at very low prices. And one of those businesses was dangerously close to home. My family's company. According to public filings, the new firm had already begun quietly purchasing shares from smaller investors connected to our business. They were positioning themselves for a takeover. My chest tightened when I realized the full danger. If they gained control of enough shares, they could force a buyout and take over the entire company. My family had no idea this was happening. They still believed I was the reason the company had lost money. Meanwhile, the same group responsible for the original fraud was now moving to take the rest. For the first time since leaving home, I seriously considered going back. But one question haunted me. Would they even listen? For several days, I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to forget everything and move on with my life. The family had made their decision about me. They had pushed me away when I needed them most. Why should I return now? But every time I thought about it, the same truth came back to me. The company meant everything to them. It represented decades of hard work. If the takeover succeeded, they would lose far more than money. They would lose their legacy. And I knew something they didn't. The people targeting them had already destroyed one company through fraud. They would not hesitate to do it again. So I prepared everything carefully. I organized months of research into a detailed report, financial trails, shell companies, consulting connections, and the hidden ownership structures. Every piece of evidence showed the same conclusion. The collapse that ruined our investment had been planned, and the same network was now moving toward our family business. When the report was finished, I stared at it for a long time. Walking back into that house meant facing the people who believed I had failed them. They might refuse to hear me again. They might even throw me out. But the risk of staying silent was worse. So the next morning I drove back to the house where everything had fallen apart. The building looked exactly the same as the night I left. Lights glowed through the windows. I stood outside the door for several seconds before knocking. When the door finally opened, the expression I saw was not welcoming. Shock, confusion, and something close to resentment. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I took a slow breath and held out the report in my hands. Because whether they believed me or not, the truth had to be told. The silence inside the house felt colder than the night air outside. I stepped into the living room slowly, holding the report tightly in my hands. Everyone who had been inside the house that evening had gathered there now. Some stood near the hallway. Others sat on the couch, watching me carefully. Their expressions were the same ones I remember from the night I left. Disappointment, distrust. I placed the report on the table in front of them. "I found something," I said. Nobody responded immediately. One person picked up the report and flipped through the pages slowly, but the reaction was not what I hoped for. Instead of concern, the room filled with skepticism. One voice finally spoke. According to them, the story sounded like an excuse. They believed I was trying to protect my reputation by creating a complicated explanation for the money we had lost. Another voice said something even harsher. They believed I had come back because I needed help. The words stung more than I expected. I tried to explain again that the failed investment had not been random. I showed them the connections between the consulting group, the startup company, and the new logistics firm now buying shares in our business. But the more I spoke, the less they believed me. To them, I was still the person who had cost them millions. After several minutes of arguing, someone pushed the report back toward me. They said the matter was finished. The company was already recovering from the loss, and they didn't want to hear more speculation. Then came the words that ended the conversation. I was told not to involve myself in the company again. For the second time in my life, I walked out of that house feeling completely alone. But this time something inside me felt different, because I knew one thing they didn't. The takeover had already begun. 2 weeks passed after that visit. During that time, the situation at the family company began changing quickly. News reports started mentioning a new logistics corporation that was aggressively buying smaller competitors. Their strategy was simple but effective. They quietly purchased shares through several investment firms until they owned a large enough portion to influence company decisions. I watched the news closely every day. Eventually, the report I feared appeared. The same corporation had now acquired a significant stake in our family business. The moment I saw the announcement, my stomach tightened. The takeover was moving faster than I expected. That night, I opened my research files again and began tracing the investment firms purchasing those shares. One by one, the ownership records led back to the same group of shell companies connected to the earlier fraud. The pattern was unmistakable. The same network that drained the startup company was now positioning itself to control our business. But something else caught my attention. One of the shell companies involved in the share purchases had transferred money to a private consulting account only a few days earlier. When I examined the consulting account more closely, I recognized it immediately. It belonged to the same consulting firm that had recommended the disastrous investment months ago. The pieces of the puzzle were finally connecting. The fraud had never been about just one startup. It was part of a larger plan. First, they manipulated investors into funding a company they controlled secretly. After draining those funds, they used the stolen money to buy struggling logistics companies like ours. My heart raced as I realized the full scope of the scheme. But the biggest challenge remained the same. My family still believed I was a problem, and without their trust, I had no way to stop what was coming. A month later, the takeover attempt became official. The new logistics corporation publicly announced its intention to purchase a controlling share of our family company. The offer looked generous on the surface. Investors were promised a high buyout price for their shares. Some smaller shareholders quickly accepted the offer because they believed it guaranteed profit. But I knew the truth behind it. Once the corporation gained control, they could restructure the business however they wanted. That often meant layoffs, asset sales, and the eventual dismantling of the original company. I tried contacting the company again. This time I sent a copy of my research report directly to the corporate office. I didn't expect a response. But surprisingly, 2 days later I received a short message asking me to attend a meeting. When I arrived at the office building, the atmosphere felt tense. Several members of the family leadership team were seated in the conference room. Their expressions were serious. One of them explained why I had been called back. The takeover announcement had forced them to examine the situation more carefully. While reviewing the corporation behind the offer, they discovered several unusual financial structures that looked similar to the ones I described in my report. For the first time since the crisis began, they were willing to listen. I spent nearly 2 hours explaining everything I had uncovered: the shell companies, the consulting group, the stolen funds from the startup collapse. The room remained quiet the entire time. When I finished, no one spoke for several seconds. Then someone asked a question that changed everything. Could I prove it? The question was fair. Evidence was the only thing that could change their minds completely. Fortunately, I had prepared for that. Over the past months, I had tracked several financial transfers between the shell companies involved in the fraud. Most of them had been carefully hidden, but a few small mistakes in international filings had left traces behind. I projected the financial timelines onto the conference room screen. First, I showed them the investment money flowing into the startup company. Then I showed the transfers moving through the shell companies. Finally, I revealed where the money ended up. The same accounts were now funding the corporation, trying to acquire our family business. The connection was undeniable. If the takeover succeeded, the people responsible for the earlier fraud would gain control of our company as well. The room felt heavier with every slide I showed. Some faces showed disbelief. Others looked angry. For a long time, nobody spoke. Then one person leaned forward and asked the most important question yet. Why would they target our company specifically? I had thought about that question many times. The answer was simple but disturbing. Our business owned several key logistics routes that connected major distribution centers across the region. Controlling those routes would give the new corporation enormous power in the transportation market. Acquiring our company was not just a financial move. It was strategic. When the presentation ended, everyone in the room understood something clearly. If my research was correct, the takeover was not just a business deal. It was a final step in a long fraud. For the first time in months, the atmosphere inside the conference room shifted. The same people who had once pushed me out of the company were now asking for my help. The irony was impossible to ignore. Just a few months earlier, they believed I had destroyed the business. Now they realized the real danger was still approaching. One person finally spoke the words that surprised me the most. They admitted that they had been too quick to judge me after the failed investment. The room remained quiet after that confession. Apologies didn't come easily in our family, but the meaning behind the statement was clear. They trusted me again. The next discussion focused on what we could do to stop the takeover. Blocking the acquisition would not be easy. The corporation already controlled a large number of shares. If they convinced enough investors to sell, they could still gain majority control. But there was one possible strategy. If we could expose the fraud publicly, regulators might investigate the corporation behind the takeover. That could freeze the acquisition process long enough for the truth to emerge. However, exposing such a large scheme required strong proof, evidence strong enough to survive legal scrutiny. That meant tracing the stolen funds all the way back to the individuals controlling the shell companies. And that would require more investigation. When the meeting ended, everyone looked at me again. This time their expressions were different. Not suspicion, expectation. They believed I was the only one who understood the scheme well enough to uncover the final evidence. The same person they once blamed for the company's losses had now become their best chance of saving it. For the first time since everything began, I felt something change inside me. They no longer saw me as the mistake. They saw me as a solution. After the meeting ended, I did not go home. Instead, I stayed inside the office long after everyone else had left. The building slowly grew quiet as the lights in different rooms turned off one by one. The company felt familiar again, yet strange at the same time. Only a few months earlier, I had walked out of this building feeling rejected. Now I had returned with a responsibility that felt much heavier than before. Saving the company would require more than suspicion. We needed proof strong enough to stop the takeover. I began reviewing the company's financial systems late into the night. The shell companies funding the acquisition had hidden their ownership carefully. Their money moved through multiple international accounts before reaching the corporation attempting the takeover. Tracing that trail required patience. But as I studied the transaction records again, I noticed something new. Some of the investment funds entering the acquiring corporation were arriving through a regional holding company that operated inside our own city. That was unusual. If the scheme was international, why would one of the financial channels operate locally? I investigated the holding company further. Its public records looked normal at first. The business claimed to specialize in financial consulting and private investment management. But when I examined their shareholder filings, something surprising appeared. A small portion of the company was owned by an individual who had previously worked as a consultant during our failed startup investment. The same consulting group was connected again. My heart began to race. If someone from that consulting group had a financial stake in the holding company funding the takeover, then the link between the fraud and the acquisition would be much stronger. But that discovery also created a troubling possibility. Someone involved in the earlier scheme might be operating much closer to us than we realized. The next morning, I presented the new discovery during another meeting. This time the room listened carefully. No one interrupted while I explained the connection between the holding company and consulting group involved in the original investment failure. The reaction was immediate. The leadership team agreed that the connection was too strong to ignore. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Who was actually controlling the scheme? Shell companies and holding firms could hide identities easily. The people behind them often stayed invisible, unless someone made a mistake. To uncover the real controllers, we needed access to deeper financial filings that were not publicly available. Fortunately, one member of the team suggested contacting a regulatory agency that specialized in corporate financial investigations. If the takeover attempt involved money linked to fraud, the regulators would have authority to investigate. Within a few days, a formal report was submitted with the evidence we had gathered so far. Then we waited. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. During that time, the corporation continued purchasing shares of our company through different investment firms. Every week, their ownership percentage grew larger. If they crossed a certain threshold, they could demand voting control during the next shareholder meeting. That meant we had limited time. One evening, while reviewing company emails, I noticed something strange. A confidential internal document about our logistics routes had been accessed several times by someone outside the normal management team. The file contained sensitive operational data that could be extremely valuable to a competitor planning a takeover. My eyes narrowed as I examined the access records more closely. The file had been opened by someone inside our company. The discovery of that internal access log troubled me deeply. The document contained information about our most profitable transportation routes and warehouse locations. That kind of data could help an acquiring corporation plan how to control the business after a takeover. But why would someone inside our company open the file repeatedly? I studied the access records carefully. The file had been opened several times over the past 2 months. Each access happened late at night, when the office was almost empty. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. On 2 of those nights, the document had been downloaded to an external storage device. That meant the information could have been copied and shared outside the company. My heart sank as I realized what this might mean. The takeover attempt might not only be coming from outside. Someone inside the company could be helping them. The idea was difficult to accept, but the evidence pointed in that direction. I followed the digital trail further. Eventually, the access logs revealed the user account connected to the downloads. When I saw it, I stared at the screen for several seconds. The account belonged to someone who had worked with the company for years. Someone trusted by everyone in the organization. Someone who had strongly supported removing me from the business after the failed investment. The realization felt like a heavy weight in my chest. If this person had been secretly sharing company data with the acquiring corporation, then the takeover attempt had inside help from the beginning, and that meant the situation was even more dangerous than we thought. I brought the new evidence to the leadership team immediately. The room grew tense as I explained what I had discovered. At first, some people struggled to believe it. The person connected to the suspicious access logs had been loyal to the company for many years. Trust had been built slowly over time, but the digital records were clear. The confidential document had been downloaded using that account. We needed to be careful. Accusing someone without full proof could create legal problems. Instead, we decided to quietly monitor all system activity connected to that account. Over the next several days, the security team installed additional monitoring software within the company's network. Then we waited. Late one evening, the alert finally appeared. The same account had logged into the system again after normal office hours. Within minutes, the user opened another confidential file containing information about warehouse lease agreements and shipping contracts. The pattern was repeating. This time, however, the security team was ready. They traced the connection in real time. What they discovered confirmed our worst fears. The data being downloaded was transmitted through an encrypted network link connected to the same holding company funding the takeover attempt. The evidence was undeniable now. Someone inside the company had been feeding sensitive information directly to the group attempting to acquire us. The betrayal ran deeper than we imagined, but exposing it would require careful planning, because once the insider realized we were watching, they might disappear before the truth could be revealed. The next step had to be handled carefully. We could not confront the insider immediately. If they were connected to the larger fraud network, warning them too early might allow the entire group to hide their tracks. Instead, we decided to gather as much evidence as possible first. Over the next week, the monitoring system recorded every login connected to the suspicious account. The results shocked everyone. Confidential company documents were being accessed almost every night. Some files contained strategic plans for new shipping routes. Others included supplier contracts and financial forecasts. All of it was valuable information that could help the acquiring corporation weaken our business. Then something even more surprising happened. One evening, the insider accessed a document related to the original startup investment that had caused our financial loss months earlier. The same investment that had destroyed my reputation. That moment changed everything. If the insider had access to those files back then, it meant they might have known about the risky investment long before it collapsed. The possibility sent a chill through me. What if the failure that pushed me out of the company had not been an accident at all? What if someone inside the company had quietly supported the deal because it benefited the fraud network? If that was true, the entire crisis that divided our family might have been manipulated from the beginning, and the person responsible had been working beside us the whole time. By the time we reached that point, the tension inside the company had become almost unbearable. Every person in leadership knew there was an insider helping the takeover attempt, but only a few of us knew who the digital records pointed toward. Even then, we had not confronted the person yet. Instead, we continued watching. Every night, the monitoring system recorded activity from the same account. Documents were opened, downloaded, and quietly transmitted through encrypted channels. But something unexpected happened during the second week of monitoring. The insider accessed a folder containing old board meeting records. Inside that folder was a documentation from the original startup investment, the one that had caused a financial loss and destroyed my reputation. Seeing that file open again made my chest tighten. The monitoring team traced the download carefully. Within minutes, the file was transmitted through the same encrypted connection, linked to the holding company funding the takeover attempt. At that moment, a disturbing thought crossed my mind. The person inside our company had not only helped the takeover, they had been connected to the earlier investment disaster as well. If that was true, then the situation months earlier might not have been a simple mistake. Someone could have quietly supported the risky deal because it helped the fraud network steal money from the startup collapse. And when the investment failed, I became the perfect person to blame. The idea made my stomach twist. Everything that had happened might have been part of a much larger plan. The leadership team met again the following morning. This time the atmosphere was different. Everyone understood that the insider's actions were no longer just suspicious. The evidence now connected them directly to the takeover network. We reviewed the monitoring data carefully. File transfers, login times, network connections. Everything pointed toward the same account. But confronting the insider still carried risks. If the person realized they had been exposed, they might warn the takeover group immediately. That could allow the fraud network to move money or destroy evidence before regulators arrived. Fortunately, something else happened that helped us. The regulatory agency we contacted earlier finally responded to our report. Investigators wanted to examine the financial evidence we had gathered. They asked for a meeting the following week. That meant we only needed to hold the insider under observation for a few more days. During that time, the takeover corporation continued buying shares in our company. Their ownership percentage grew dangerously close to the level required for control. The pressure inside the office increased daily. Everyone knew that if the takeover succeeded before the fraud was exposed, the company might never recover. Then one evening, The monitoring system detected something unusual. The insider had accessed a confidential financial report and attempted to download it. But instead of sending the file to the usual encrypted address, the system recorded a different destination, a private account belonging to someone inside the acquiring corporation. For the first time, we had direct evidence connecting the insider to the takeover leadership. The trap was finally closing. The moment that evidence appeared, the leadership team decided it was time to act. We contacted the investigators immediately and shared the new information. Within hours, they confirmed that the financial trail we discovered matched records they had been tracking in other corporate investigations. The takeover corporation had already been linked to suspicious financial movements in multiple industries. Our case might be the missing piece connecting everything together. The investigators asked us to continue monitoring the insider for one more day while they prepared legal authorization for a full inquiry. That night felt longer than any other. I stayed in the office late, watching the security dashboard with the monitoring team. Around midnight, the insider logged into the system again. Several confidential documents were opened in quick succession. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of downloading files, the insider began deleting records connected to the original startup investment. My heart pounded as I watched the activity unfold. The person clearly knew something was wrong. They were trying to erase evidence. Fortunately, the monitoring system had already copied every file earlier. Even if the insider deleted them from the company database, the backup records still existed. Within minutes, the investigators contacted us again. They had received emergency authorization to intervene. The following morning, they would arrive at the office. For the first time since the crisis began, I felt a strange mix of tension and relief. The truth was finally about to come out. The investigators arrived early the next morning. Several officials entered the building quietly and began reviewing the monitoring data we had collected. They examined the access logs, the encrypted file transfers, and financial connections between the insider and the takeover corporation. It didn't take long for them to reach the same conclusion we had. The insider had been feeding confidential company information to the acquisition group for months. But the most shocking discovery came when they examined the financial records connected to the original startup investment. The investigators uncovered a hidden payment that had been transferred from the consulting group into an offshore account shortly before our company approved the investment. That offshore account was partially controlled by the same insider. The room went silent when the investigators revealed that detail. It meant the person had secretly benefited from the investment deal long before it collapsed. The failure that destroyed our money had actually produced profit for the insider. My chest tightened as I realized the full truth. The entire disaster months earlier had been manipulated. The risky investment had been encouraged from the inside. And when everything failed, I became the person blamed for it. The investigators quickly prepared to confront the insider. But before they could reach the office, something unexpected happened. The security system showed the person leaving the building quickly. They had somehow sensed the investigation, and they were trying to escape. The moment the security alert appeared, everyone in the room reacted instantly. The investigators contacted building security and asked them to stop the insider before they could leave the property. For several tense minutes, no one knew what would happen. Then the radio on the investigator's desk crackled. Security had stopped the person in the parking area. The investigators moved quickly. Within minutes, they escorted the insider back into the building and began questioning them in a private office. I didn't hear the entire conversation, but the outcome became clear very quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial transfers, confidential document leaks, secret payments linked to the earlier investment. The insider eventually admitted to cooperating with the consulting group that had organized the scheme. Their role had been simple: encourage the risky startup investment from inside the company, then quietly provide business information to help the takeover corporation prepare its acquisition. In return, they received secret payments through offshore accounts. The betrayal felt almost unreal. Someone we trusted had nearly destroyed the company from the inside. But the situation was not over yet. Even with the insider exposed, the takeover corporation still held a large portion of company shares. Stopping them completely would require proving the entire fraud network publicly. And that battle was only beginning. After the insider confessed, the investigators moved quickly. They began tracing every financial connection linked to the takeover corporation. The evidence we had gathered inside the company became the foundation of a much larger investigation. For the first time since everything began, I felt a sense of momentum. The investigators discovered that the consulting group behind the failed startup investment had secretly controlled several shell companies. Those companies had drained money from investors, including our family business. The stolen funds had then been moved into the corporation, attempting to acquire logistics companies across the region. It was a cycle. First, they created financial disasters for targeted businesses. Then they used the stolen money to buy those same weakened companies. Our family company had almost become the next victim. The investigators informed financial regulators and corporate oversight agencies. Within days, a formal investigation into the takeover corporation was announced publicly. The news spread quickly across business networks. Investors who had previously supported the acquisition suddenly became nervous. Several investment firms began pulling back their offers to sell shares. The takeover corporation tried to continue buying stock, but now regulators were watching every transaction carefully. The pressure on them was growing. Inside the company, the atmosphere had completely changed. People who once avoided speaking to me now approached with questions and ideas. They wanted updates about the investigation and asked for my opinion on how the situation might unfold. It felt strange. Only months earlier, they believed I had destroyed the business. Now, they depended on me to help save it. But the truth was clear. The final outcome would depend on whether the investigators could expose the entire fraud network before the takeover corporation made its final move. The investigation expanded faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, regulators uncovered financial records connecting the takeover corporation to several suspicious transactions across different industries. The pattern was always the same. A consulting group would promote an investment opportunity to targeted companies. The opportunity would collapse later, leaving the investors weakened financially. Soon after, shell companies connected to the same network would begin buying shares in those weakened businesses. Our company had been only one part of a much larger scheme. News organizations began reporting the story publicly. Financial analysts described it as one of the most complex corporate fraud operations in recent years. As the investigation continued, regulators placed temporary restrictions on the takeover corporation's ability to purchase additional shares. That decision slowed the acquisition process significantly. Inside our company, the leadership team used the time carefully. We contacted smaller investors who still held shares and explained the situation. Many of them agreed to hold their positions rather than selling to the takeover group. Every share that remained outside their control weakened their ability to take over the company. Meanwhile, the investigators continued tracing the stolen money from the original startup collapse. Their goal was to identify the individuals who controlled the shell companies behind the scheme. When they finally discovered those identities, the results shocked the entire industry. Several high-ranking executives within the takeover corporation had secretly managed the shell companies themselves. The fraud had been organized from the very top. The moment that information became public, everything changed. The announcement created immediate chaos inside the takeover corporation. Regulators launched formal legal actions against the executives involved in the scheme. Their financial accounts were frozen while investigators examined years of transaction records. Stock prices connected to the corporation dropped rapidly. Investors who had supported the acquisition rushed to distance themselves from the company. Inside our office, the mood shifted from tension to cautious optimism. For months, we had been fighting against a powerful organization that seemed impossible to stop. Now the truth was finally catching up with them. But one major challenge still remained. Even though the fraud network had been exposed, the takeover corporation still owned a large portion of our company's shares. Those shares gave them influence over certain corporate decisions. To fully protect the business, we needed to reduce that influence. The leadership team proposed a solution. If we could secure enough investment from trusted partners, the company could buy back the shares controlled by the takeover corporation. That process would remove their control completely. The plan required careful negotiation and strong financial backing. But now that the fraud had been exposed, several industry partners showed interest in helping us. They believed the company had strong long-term potential. For the first time in months, the future of the business looked hopeful again. Still, the final steps would require patience. The company had survived the attack. Now we needed to rebuild stronger than before. Over the next few months, the company worked steadily to stabilize its position. New investment partners joined the business, helping us buy back many of the shares previously controlled by the takeover corporation. With each successful transaction, their influence over the company weakened. Eventually, they held only a small minority position. The threat of a hostile takeover had finally disappeared. Inside the company, many changes also took place. Security systems were upgraded to prevent future data breaches. Financial oversight procedures were strengthened to ensure that risky investments could not be pushed through secretly again. The leadership team also created a new strategy for expanding the logistics network. This time, the focus was on careful growth and transparent partnerships. During one meeting, something happened that I never expected. The leadership team asked me to take a permanent role, guiding the company's strategic decisions. Their reasoning was simple. Throughout the crisis, I had uncovered the fraud network, exposed the insider, and helped protect the company from the takeover. They believed my experience had become essential to the future of the business. Hearing those words felt strange. Not long ago, the same people believed I had nearly destroyed the company. Now they trusted me with helping lead it forward. Life had a strange way of changing perspectives. But the most meaningful moment was still waiting, because there was one final conversation that needed to happen. One evening, after most employees had left the office, the leadership team asked me to stay behind. The atmosphere in the room felt calm, almost reflective. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one person finally broke the silence. They said something that surprised me. They admitted that months earlier, when the investment collapsed, they had allowed anger and fear to guide their judgment. Instead of asking questions, they had looked for someone to blame, and I had become the easiest target. The words were honest. No excuses, just acknowledgement. Another person added that if I had truly walked away and never returned, the company might not exist anymore. The fraud network would have taken control without resistance. Hearing that truth felt both heavy and meaningful. I had spent months believing I had lost my place in the family and the company forever. But in the end, the experience had changed everything. The business had survived a powerful attack. The truth had been exposed. And the person they once doubted had become someone they depended on. As I left the office that night, I looked back at the building one more time. Months earlier, I had walked away from it feeling rejected and alone. Now I walked away knowing something very different. Sometimes a moment when people turn their backs on you becomes a moment that shapes your future. Because when the truth finally appears, the person they once rejected may become the one they need the most.